Hello, and welcome to another Precision Flyer Repairs video. This one is on early American Flyer by Gilbert diesel motors versus the later production. And many times what happens is, with regard to the Santa Fe PA engines, the Alcos, number 360, which came early, and the 470, which followed the 360 later on. Now, while they look very similar to each other, except for the cab number of 360 versus 470, there's actually considerable internal difference, which is sometimes lost on people. And while I have the privilege right now to overhaul a few diesels for a customer, I thought I'd make a video of some of the differences you run across, since these are literally side by side now on my workbench. It's kind of ironic to begin with that the 360 was the early production for the Santa Fe passenger sets, because it came with the yeoman's duty of trying to pull aluminum passenger cars, and those were pretty heavy and a lot of work to pull as compared to the later production plastic injection molded passenger cars. So the early aluminum 66X versus the later production plastic injection molded bodied or streamlined cars 96X series actually put more work on the weaker early 360 than the later stronger production 470. So let's take a look. First of all, one of the main things that you should notice is that the armature on a later production model is larger and therefore stronger than the early production model. Hopefully you can see what a considerable difference there is there in field length. This is off a 360. This is actually off a 372, but the same armature that would have been in a 470. And the segment difference there is that much more wire and that much more torque and that much more strength in the later motor than the earlier one. You can also notice, while we have these up here, that the later ones came with bronze worm gears and the earlier ones came with steel worm gears. Another difference too was, even as Gilbert production goes, this is off a 372 and it's a plastic drive gear that goes on the axle, whereas this is a 360 chassis, and you can see clearly the drive gears on these early models were made of steel also. Another difference that's interesting is, if you look at the thrust plates on some of these, you'll see this is off a 470 or 372 or later production truck, and the thrust plates are black and they're fiber, whereas these two earlier production 360 chassis are equipped with metal thrust plates, not the fiber or softer material. And while we have these two 360s up, I thought I'd show you that one is black and one is silver. The 360s were originally done black, and then they later went, even though it was still 360 production, to the silver. While we have trucks next to truck, let's take a look at that later production on top and that early production on the bottom. And you can see here the difference in accommodating the armature size difference. Look at this narrow field bay that we have on the 360 versus how much longer that field bay is to accommodate the larger winding segments on the armature of the 470 and those later production diesels. The fields, of course, for the early motors were more narrow than the field on the later, to accommodate the fact that the armature segments are longer on the later and narrower on the early. Another difference, of course, is the 470 and later series came with Pullmore vulcanized rubber tires to give extra pulling strength. and the early 360 had nothing but all metal wheels. And actually that's a good thing, because with the heavy aluminum cars, the weaker, smaller motors, to have loaded the motors with extra traction would have probably meant more of their demise than as it is, many of them wore out. Another difference you can see here is the earlier chassis were factory equipped with bushings, and those are quite easily replaced, as I've shown in another how-to page on my website. These have been done. Now this is the later one. This would need to be drilled out if it were in requirement of bushings, but actually the holes on this one are still quite good and can get reused. But whereas this one, the early one, had the disadvantage of the smaller armature and no pull more, it had the advantage of having been originally bushed with bushings at the factory, which was a nice durability touch. And the later one, although it got the larger motor, the pull more wheels, they skipped putting the bushings in, which really I think were a good thing while they were doing that. So that was just a quick orientation to you about the difference between these two. I hope that it helps you in selecting your different engines and being cognizant of the difference many times lost on that between the early Santa Fe 360 PA and the later production 470. One other smaller subtle note is that on the early ones, you'll many times find the brushes that make contact with the armature round, and in the later production models they went to square, probably for the purposes of manufacturing alignment. But I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to point out while I had these here on the workbench to look at with you. And so until we meet again, be well, have fun running your trains, and if you need more information, feel free to visit my website at www.precisionflyerrepairs.com. Thank you.